The reality was I hadn't spoken to Mr. Cosby, and I felt that it would be kind of tactless.
It's tragic however you look at it, whether he's found guilty, innocent, that you're even going through it.
You're working with the most intelligent person on the planet. He's very discerning, always lifting everybody around.
Felicia Rashad, who for decades has been praised as the poised, graceful, and sharp-witted Claire Huxtable, shocked the world when she finally peeled back the curtain of silence she had been hiding behind. At 77 years old, she admitted that the legacy of The Cosby Show was not only about laughter and cultural progress, but also about secrets, denial, and regret. In her words, the series brought joy to millions and changed television forever. But behind the laughter, she carried a heaviness she could never speak of. She recalls moments on set that looked normal to the outside world but felt unsettling, up close. Cosby would regularly bring women into spaces that weren't part of production, leaving her wondering why they were there and why so many of them appeared nervous or out of place. She says she trained herself not to stare too long, not to ask too many questions, because in that era and under Cosby's towering presence, looking away seemed safer than confronting the truth. Rashad confesses she convinced herself she was powerless, but deep down she knew that staying silent gave Cosby space to operate unchecked. She describes the guilt as a shadow that never left, something that followed her home every night, after filming and whispered to her every time she looked at herself in the mirror. She remembers the laughter of the studio audience mixing with her unease, a bizarre contrast between America's adoration of America's dad and her own quiet suspicion that something was very wrong. This first admission is not just about the past. It is about the courage to finally say aloud what she buried for decades, and the painful acknowledgement that silence was her greatest mistake. Looking back, Rashad explains that the environment around The Cosby Show made speaking out almost impossible. This was not just another sitcom. It was NBC's crown jewel, a cultural phenomenon that reshaped American television and became a global symbol of Black family success. In the mid-1980s, Cosby was not merely a star, he was an empire. He influenced scripts, decisions, wardrobe, even the tone of every episode. Everyone around him, from producers to executives, treated him as untouchable. Rashad recalls meetings where even small creative disagreements would vanish if Cosby pushed back, because no one dared to oppose him. This level of power created an atmosphere where questions were dangerous and silence became the currency of survival. She admits she wasn't the only one who noticed troubling behavior, but the culture of fear ensured that nothing was ever confronted. To raise suspicion was to risk being labeled disloyal, and in that era, loyalty to Cosby was the ticket to keeping your career. She describes it as living in a fortress. On the outside, it looked like brilliance, but inside, walls of fear kept everyone quiet. Rashad says she told herself that if the executives weren't doing anything, if the network wasn't stepping in, maybe it wasn't her place to act. But with hindsight, she sees that this rationalization was a trap, one that protected Cosby but harmed countless others. She admits the complicity of silence was as damaging as the actions themselves, because it allowed a culture of invincibility to grow unchecked around him. Her silence, Rashad reveals, was also shaped by the fragile realities of being a Black woman in Hollywood during the 1980s. At the time, opportunities for actresses of color were so rare that losing one role could mean the end of an entire career. Landing the part of Claire Huxtable wasn't just a job. It was history in the making, a role that redefined how Black women were portrayed on television. To risk all of that by challenging Cosby felt unthinkable. Rashad recalls the weight of that fear, knowing that Hollywood wasn't kind to women who questioned powerful men. She believed that if she raised her voice, she wouldn't just lose her role, she'd be branded difficult, blacklisted, and erased from an industry that already barely made room for her. She admits she built her silence into a shield, convincing herself that survival came first. Yet, decades later, when she saw dozens of women stepping forward, Recounting stories of violation and betrayal, she realized her silence had protected the wrong person. The regret was unbearable. She began to replay those moments in her mind, the nervous glances of young women, the private conversations she turned away from, the things she pretended not to notice. Every memory became sharper, clearer, more painful. Rashad confesses that guilt has lived with her longer than any success ever could. While the world celebrated her as the perfect mother figure, she quietly carried the truth that she hadn't spoken when it mattered most. She acknowledges now that fear may have cost her less than her silence ultimately did, because living with that guilt has been a wound she could never fully close. After Cosby's fall from grace and the collapse of his once-celebrated legacy, Felicia Rashad found herself facing the reality she had long avoided. Hollywood no longer defined her. Instead, she turned toward theater and education, choosing to use her talents in spaces that allowed truth and healing. At Howard University, where she became Dean of the College of Fine Arts, she poured herself into mentoring young artists, not just in acting technique, but in resilience, integrity, and courage. She told her students that talent was nothing without a strong voice, and that silence in the face of wrongdoing could cost them their soul. Directing plays that explored themes of power, betrayal, and silence, she found herself confronting her own past indirectly, as though each production was also a mirror to her own story. For Rashad, teaching was more than a job. It was therapy, redemption, and a second chance. She knew she couldn't undo her decades of silence, but she could shape a generation that would never be silent in the same way she had been. She acknowledges that each lesson she taught was as much for her as it was for her students. A reminder to herself that courage must outweigh fear. These years of teaching and directing became her path toward healing, a way of rewriting her legacy from one of complicity to one of guidance, and from silence to empowerment. Now, Felicia Rashad speaks without fear. Her confession is raw, difficult, and painful. But it is also a liberation she says she never thought she would allow herself. She admits openly that she cannot erase her choices, but she refuses to hide from them any longer. In addressing Cosby's actions, she stresses the importance of recognizing how dangerous unchecked power can be, and how silence only strengthens abusers. She warns that silence is not protection. It is complicity, a shield that hides truth, but also prevents justice. Rashad knows that her confession has shocked many who saw her as flawless, but she embraces that imperfection because, in her words, the truth, no matter how late, is better than a lifetime of lies. She no longer sees herself as the perfect Claire Huxtable. She sees herself as a flawed but resilient woman who has finally chosen honesty. She hopes her story will serve as a warning to anyone who feels powerless in the face of injustice. Your voice matters more than your fear. She admits she has spent decades weighed down by guilt, but in speaking out now, she has discovered a freedom she never thought possible. Her voice, once buried under fear and silence, is now unshakable. Felicia Rashad may not be America's mom anymore, but she has become something even more important. A woman unafraid to own her past and determined to inspire future generations to choose truth over silence, no matter the cost.